So here we are again. Welcome back. For those of you here in Southeast Wisconsin, I really hope you're finding some time to get out and enjoy this wonderful day. Um, but for the next few minutes, I want to turn our attention back to Peter, who we explored last week. Today, however, we do so in the context of his interaction with Cornelius that is recorded in the 10th chapter of Acts. Now, this is a long story, and I'm not going to read all of it, but it starts with this man named Cornelius, an official of the Roman army who was a devoted believer in God. And one afternoon, Cornelius has a vision that he is to send some of his men to find a man named Simon Peter. So he sends off those men, and then as they are traveling, the story turns to Peter himself. And this starts with the 9th verse of chapter 10. It says that about noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry, wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air, and then he heard a voice saying, Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." And the voice said to him a second time again, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." And this happened 3 times. And then the thing was suddenly taken up into heaven. Now, we're going to keep going with the story, but we need to pause here for a minute to make sure that we're clear on the backdrop of this vision. The Jewish law was very clear when it came to these questions of being clean. Who you were with, what you touched, what you ate, these were all things that could defile a person and make them unfit to come before God. So what we have in this vision is something of a cornucopia of all of the things that Peter has spent his life avoiding. Things that would make him unclean, things that would make him unfit to come before God. And as Peter looks upon this sheet full of unclean foods, God says, "You don't make that choice. I do." So here, then, the story continues on as those representatives from Cornelius arrive, and we continue on with the story here in the 17th verse. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. And while Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you're looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. Now from here, the story goes on as Peter accompanies these men back to Cornelius. He's invited by Cornelius to speak, and then he begins to preach the gospel among Cornelius and all of the Gentiles. And that right there is a turning point, not only for Peter, but for the church as a whole. Because remember, up until this moment, the work of the apostles had been centered within that Jewish world. They understood Jesus to be the Messiah of whom the prophets had spoken. Peter himself was the first one to make that declaration. So they were preaching the word of Jesus within the community of those who had been awaiting that Messiah, of those who were part of that Jewish identity to which they believed the Messiah had been sent. This message, they thought, was for them. Not for those unclean Gentiles, but what comes out so clearly in Peter's story is that God had other plans. And that, for me, is really the standout element of Peter's journey as a whole. Peter, if you look at him throughout the narrative, he was the first of so many things in the story of Jesus and in the story of the early church. He was the first to be called to follow Jesus. He was the first to name Jesus as the Messiah. He was the first to witness the resurrection. He was the first to preach to the Gentiles. There's some tradition that his preaching is the inspiration behind the writing of the first gospel. And there's even other tradition that suggests he was the first pope of the Roman Church. Now, I don't want to get into those details of each of those moments and those experiences and whether those traditions are accurate or not, but the point is that Peter was constantly redirected from the plans and expectations that he had in mind. Peter was living a fine life with his wife as a fisherman. Jesus called him to be a fisher of men. Peter was settling into his routine as a disciple of this teacher named Jesus. God inspired within him an understanding that this was the Messiah. And Jesus named Peter as the rock on which the church would be built. Peter was grieving over the death of his teacher and friend. Mary came in screaming that the tomb was empty. Peter was convinced that his word and his preaching was for the Jewish a community. God sent him to the unclean and unworthy Gentiles to share the gospel. Now, I could keep going with all of this, but there's an old phrase that I've often enjoyed that if you want to make God laugh, tell him all about your plans. We thrive on our ability to map out that which is next, to anticipate what is to come, to envision the future. And I don't think there has ever been a time that we've been less able to do that than this period we've experienced these past few months. So often right now, I think back to Wednesday, March 13th. As many of you know, Sharon works the night shift, and I remember so clearly that as she awakened from her daytime sleep on that Wednesday, March 13th, I spoke to her when she got out of bed, and I said to her, "This is a different world than the one you went to sleep in this morning." That was the day that Tom Hanks announced he had contracted COVID-19. That was the day the NBA pulled players off the floor with fans sitting in the stands. And that was the day that our entire social consciousness shifted in a matter of a couple of hours. And ever since, it has been a daily barrage of the unknown and unpredictable, wrenching at those of us who long to rely on our plans. But still, we are constantly reminded that God is at work. Whether we can have our plans or not, whether we can envision what is next or not, the simple reality is that our plans often do nothing but make God laugh. Because God is at work. God has a way. God will guide us in that way, and plans or no plans. As hard as it is for us to sit in the unknown, God is at work. And there is a better tomorrow in store that will surprise us all. Let's join in prayer together. Gracious God, be at work in our angst, in our riddled consternation, in our attempts to plan the unplannable. God, grant us your spirit of peace, the comfort of your presence, and the wonder of simply being open to that which you will unveil in the days before us. For we pray it in his name. Amen. As always, I pray you have a wonderful afternoon, and I will be right back here tomorrow at noon.